Hi, and welcome to Exploring Your Life's Purpose. I am Angela Levesque, and I'm going to be leading you through this webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, I know many of the people that signed up for this already do, but my clinical background is actually as an exercise physiologist, but mostly I work as an empowerment coach. I do energy healing. I'm a writer, and mostly I just like to help people get excited about their lives. And one of the reasons that I absolutely love to speak on igniting your life's purpose is actually the name of this. I teach this as well as a Boise Community Ed class. And one of the reasons that I love to teach about this is because there's a lot going on in our world. And I think one of the best ways to deal with some of our challenges, and this is like geopolitically, this is environmentally, is really to start with the individual and get them more engaged in their life so that their choices have more meaning and purpose behind them. And so that's kind of why I do that. When I think about my son and when I think about him growing up, I want him to live in a world where people feel connected to their values, where they know why they're here, they show up in alignment with why they're here. And I think that that is really the key to making a better world. So we are going to be talking about all of those things today as we explore the topic of your life's purpose. Let's see. So let's see here. So what is purpose? Often we think of purpose, obviously, as the reason for which something is done or created or for which something exists. So what is the purpose of this? And we often talk about purpose like it's something that we find outside of ourselves. So we'll often hear people talking about, finding our purpose, and it's almost like it's something that we go out and, we'll stumble upon somewhere out externally. And I really have a different view of purpose. And that is really understanding that it is an action that comes from within. So purpose isn't so much something we find, but rather something that is expressed from the very core of who we are. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'll show you kind of the general. This is a Venn diagram. You can just go online and Google life purpose, and you can find this, and you can see that which you're good at, that which you love, that which the world needs, and that which you can be paid for. And so within those, you have passion, mission, profession, and vocation. And one of the reasons I don't really enjoy this, I think it's pretty good, but one of the reasons I don't really enjoy it is because it leads people to think, again, that our purpose has to be something that provides us with money. Now, in an ideal world, that would be very fantastic. But when we don't look at purpose as something that we have to find outside of ourselves, we realize that purpose can be expressed beyond just our jobs. And so it really can be expressed in any role that we have. And so that could be through, being a parent. It could be through your job. It could be through volunteer. It could just be through our own self-care and doing the stuff that we really love to do. So when we look at it as something internal rather than something that we find outside of ourselves, we realize that when we get in touch with who we really are, that can be expressed by ourselves, it can be expressed in our job, it can be expressed in our relationships. And I think that that's such a more valuable way to look at purpose than just looking at it from, okay, well, can I do this as my job? So here's my different perspective. And so purpose is really our heart, which is our internal guidance system, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, our values and our actions. So again, consider that it's more than a reason or a role that you play or some sort of fulfillment of desire, but it's actually getting in touch with our core authentic self and providing opportunities for that experience and the expression of that. So I want to start today with a little reading. It's actually by Oriah Mountain Dreamer. and it's called The Invitation. And many of you might have heard of that before. I often read this in my class, and she wrote this really beautiful, well, it is an invitation, but this really beautiful piece of prose. And the impetus for writing it is she had a very close friend who had a brain aneurysm. And so over the course of the year, she had to watch her friend relearn how to walk and talk and all of those really basic motor functions, all of those things that we really take for granted in our lives. She had to go and relearn all of those things. And so while she's watching her friend go through this, she's going to these parties and these, whatever, these events, and people are coming up and they're having those regular conversations like, oh, what do you do? What do you do? Like we're able to really catch a glimpse of somebody just by kind of, oh, I'm a doctor, or I'm a cashier, or, I'm a lawyer or a teacher. And by giving those little tiny glimpses of who we are, that kind of gives them an idea, oh, put us in the teacher box or in the lawyer box. And, she had that kind of juxtaposition between watching her friends struggle and relearn all of these things and really like just witnessing just how beautiful life is, how just the breadth of the human spirit on one hand, and then going and having these really vapid, shallow conversations on the other hand. So she wrote this. Again, her name's Orion Mountain Dreamer, and it's called The Invitation. And whether you're listening to this live right now or you're listening to it after the fact, if you can just pause and take a moment and really listen, because it's dripping with heart and energy. It says, it doesn't interest me what you do for a living. I want to know what you ache for, and if you dare to dream of meeting your heart's longing. It doesn't interest me how old you are. I want to know if you'll risk looking like a fool for love, for your dream, for the adventure of being alive. It doesn't interest me what planets are squaring your moon. I want to know if you've touched the center of your own sorrow, if you have been opened by life's betrayals or have become shriveled and closed for fear of further pain. I want to know if you can sit with pain, mine or your own, without moving to hide it or fade it or fix it. I want to know if you can be with joy, mine or your own, if you can dance with the wildness and let the ecstasy fill you to the tips of your fingers and toes without cautioning us to be careful, to be realistic, to remember the limitations of being human. It doesn't interest me if the story you're telling me is true. I want to know if you can disappoint another to be true to yourself, if you can bear the accusation of betrayal and not betray your own soul. I want to know if you can see beauty, even when it's not pretty, every day, and if you can source your own life from its presence. I want to know if you can live with failure, yours and mine, and still stand on the edge of the lake and shout to the silver of the full moon, yes. It doesn't interest me to know where you live or how much money you have. I want to know if you can get up after a night of grief and despair, weary and bruised to the bone, and do what needs to be done to feed the children. It doesn't interest me who you know or how you came to be here. I want to know if you'll stand in the center of the fire with me and not shrink back. It doesn't interest me where or what or with whom you have studied. I want to know what sustains you from the inside when all else falls away. I want to know if you can be alone with yourself and if you truly like the company you keep in the empty moments. So every time I read that, I get a little bit choked up because that is the type and the level of relationship that I would love to have with people. And granted, I understand that if you decided to go to a party and ask if they want to stand on the edge of the silver lake and shout yes to the moon, that might be a little bit overbearing. But I think the point is that that's the level that we need to be in touch with ourselves. If we can't answer those questions for our own self, we certainly can't ask that of other people. But isn't that the kind of relationships that you would like to have? I just will stop for a moment that at the bottom of this screen, there's the chat, and I have the chat box open. So if you feel like asking me a question or commenting, please feel free to do so. I want to talk for a moment about the internal guidance system. So purpose here is our heart, which is our internal guidance system, which is a mixture of our intuition, our emotion, our desire, our imagination. So there's all these pieces here that help guide us when we're quiet enough to be able to listen. Our values, which we're going to talk a lot about coming up, and our actions. And to me, that's what purpose is. It's getting in touch with who we are, our heart, knowing who we are, our values, which is a combination, I think, of heart and mind. And then do we go out and do we take actions on that? So I want to talk for a moment about high-level purpose versus small acts of purpose. And I think that they're both really important. And again, if we look at something like our health, yes, we can go and we can see our massage therapist and our chiropractor and our primary care physician, and that's all great. But it is our day-to-day actions that make the biggest impact on our health. The same kind of thing is going on here with purpose. So we can go, we can decide, we can look at things from really the 30,000 foot view and look at purpose that way. And I think that that's really important. I would call that kind of like soul level purpose as well. But then there's also the small acts of purpose. And this is really what connects us to our life. This is really what makes us wake up every day and feel like it's meaningful that we're there. And that doesn't mean that it's always happy and joyful. Sometimes it's, deep grief, and sometimes it's fear, but when we're there, when we're willing to explore, like Oriah Mountain Dreamer was, to get to those places that really, are, the deepest places within ourselves. If we're able to do that and then go and take action on that, that's where we feel excited to be alive. And so even when we do feel grief or fear or anxiety, at least we feel in it. We feel part of it. And I think that that's really important. So what do I mean by, we'll start with, I think, small acts of purpose. And for myself, this is something I think about all the time. So basically, are your everyday actions in alignment with your values? So I'll give you an example of this for today, for example. So I actually was building a website for a dear friend, and sometimes I get very wrapped up. Like I can just spend hours and hours and hours at my computer. But I also know that that's not from an energetic perspective. That's very taxing on me. I also know that one of my values is self-care. It's something that I take very seriously. So exercise, eating well, those kind of things are really important to me. So, I was going to go work at a coffee shop for a couple hours. Now I could just drive there, and yes, it would be much quicker, knowing that I had a lot of work to do. But instead I thought, and I do this very often, I walked 25 minutes to the coffee shop and 25 minutes home. So what did I do there? Well, for myself, that was very in alignment with many of my values. So some of my values are environmentalism and conservation. I talked about self-care and, health and well-being. And so with that simple act of taking, not even an hour of my day, I got to do work, which is also, I have a very high work ethic. And so I got to do my work how I needed to do it. But I also was still being very in touch with my needs. Again, I know that sitting at my computer for long, extended chunks of time is not a good idea for me. So I decided to walk. And in that, I satisfied my value of, I didn't drive my car, so the environmentalism. I satisfied my value of self-care. I satisfied my value of, getting my work done, having a good work ethic. So this is what I'm saying when I'm talking about small acts of purpose, is once you get really clear and identify your values, you can then go and take action. So now my choice to walk or drive my car isn't even really a choice, because going for a walk has so much value to me that it becomes a preference. So it's not like, oh man, I have to get exercise. It's like, oh, hey, why don't I just go for a walk? Another example, right? So family is really important to me. Eating real whole foods is really important to me. Again, the exercise, getting sunshine, being outside, being in nature, all of those things are really high on my values list. So one of the things when we first moved into a house that I could have a garden, that was a really big thing for me. So every, spring I get out and I tend to my garden, I plant my seeds, and, for me, that brings me so much joy. So I don't look at it as a chore of having to deal with my garden. I look at it as a small act of purpose because it's so in alignment with 4 or 5 of my values. Another really important one for me is being a good model for my child. So showing him, having him help me, plant the seeds and pick off the vegetables when they're ready, and do the harvesting. And then I come home and, I come inside and I make spaghetti sauce, or I do whatever. But you can see how that one little thing, I feel connected. And going back to that Venn diagram, I'm not going to create a vocation or get a job planting tomatoes. I mean, I could, but what I'm saying is that there was this really big aspect of who I am at my core had the opportunity to be expressed. So now let's talk a little bit about high-level purpose. And this is kind of what I would talk about from, the 30,000-foot view, or the soul level purpose. So this is really looking at that the big picture view. And this is a little bit, I think, harder to nail down. Although as we move through this webinar here, we're going to talk a lot about some of the questions that you need to ask and answer to be able to understand, from a 30,000-foot view, what is my high-level purpose? And so part of this experience is understanding that we are part of something bigger. And so if we see a need or a cause that is strongly connected to our values, this could be that high-level purpose. Looking at our worldview, looking at how we show up in the world and the lens from which we see the world. Again, it assists us in creating our high-level purpose. So we're going to come back around to this as we kind of break down how we figure that out. So before we get there, one thing I do want to talk about is being incongruent. So you've heard me mention about how important it is to understand our values and then take action on it. Well, what happens when we don't? What happens when we do know some of the things that we value and we consistently do things that are out of congruence with that? Well, that's what makes us feel I would say the most either complacent or dissatisfied or uncomfortable. In fact, the more that we start to learn about ourselves, the more uncomfortable things get for us when we start to recognize, when we have a certain depth of awareness that we are living out of congruence with our values. So it's quite easy to move into that place of listlessness or dissatisfaction when you kind of just say, oh, screw it, and you just follow, move through the motions. And so an example of this is, say that health and wellness is really high on your values, and then you start binge watching Netflix, and you realize that Netflix, you're the season, it's got 7 seasons, the show you're watching, and so you realize that you're spending hour upon hour upon hour watching Netflix. Well, maybe the first 2 or 3 seasons, you might feel okay about that. But after like season 4, 5, 6, you'll start to get really uncomfortable in your body, in your mind, in your heart, because you'll know that, wow, I have just been totally allowing this show to take me over and allowed myself to be so distracted and not do any of the things that I know really bring me joy, bring me a certain level of satisfaction, all of those things. And again, right, if maybe you could watch the 7 seasons, but maybe not spend, 3.5 weeks straight watching it. And I bet by week 2, you're starting to feel uncomfortable. And that to me is just a fantastic data point. So I like to look at it as information. So instead of beating yourself up and moving from this place of shame or fear or guilt or regret, you just say, that's a really interesting data point. I call this moving from a place of playful curiosity. So instead of, you're at 3 a.m. in the morning and you're eating Haagen-Dazs straight out of the out of the container, right? Standing in front of the freezer. Again, playful curiosity. Wow, this is really interesting. I wonder what this is about. And that's an opportunity for us to go dig deeper, to look inside and say, really, what is this about? So that we can learn. So that sense of dissatisfaction, that sense of uncomfortableness, all of those are just really awesome signals that, hey, this isn't working for us. On some level, we know that this isn't in alignment. This is incongruent with who we want to be. And again, we don't look at it from this place of, oh, I need to overcome this about myself, or I need to feel shame or guilt. Just playful curiosity, and then start to reconnect yourself with what it is that is important to you. What are your values? And then are your priorities in alignment with those things? That's on, when people start to see me, usually is when they're in a major life transition. And this life transition could be thrust upon them, could be illness, it could be divorce, job loss, or something that they knew is coming. I often work with people who are transitioning into retirement. And the same sort of thing is they start to look at, okay, who am I? And what maybe, especially when we start to identify ourself with our roles. So if you were a teacher and then all of a sudden you are now retired and you wonder, who am I? Well, getting you back in touch with the core of your being, that assists you in then finding that meaning and purpose again in your life. So let's talk about some really important questions to consider. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send me a message in the chat. So a really, really big one here is, why are we here? And this isn't just as an individual, but why is humanity here? Why do humans exist? What is the reason for that? And I often, I have a certain perspective from which I coach and teach, and I have a very specific worldview. But my worldview does not have to be your worldview. So I want to give you a few examples of other ways that people answer this question. So for myself, I would be, 3 down. I would be the evolution of the soul. So my soul is here to learn things, so consciousness can know itself. So we move through this beautiful evolution and kind of spiraling up as we move through different levels of consciousness, through different lessons that we've set ourselves up for. Now that is, well, I believe that might not be what your understanding of the meaning of life is. So some perspectives. Epicurus, he was a Greek philosopher, and he believed that life was all about seeking pleasure. So he said, what more do I need? I can hang out with my friends in the garden and we can enjoy, the pleasures of life, drink and food. And that's why there's Epicurean magazine, right? The pleasure from food. And he's like, and we can have these great conversations. And so why look for anything else when this is so satisfying? So from his perspective, it was to seek pleasure. And then you might have a more scientific or kind of a rational, a more scientific or rational worldview. And that's really to understand the world objectively. So you want to understand how things fit together and, kind of looking at things on a small scale to understand the larger scale. And again, there's lots of people who have a more rational or scientific worldview. To liberate the mind from suffering. So this is very in alignment with Eastern thought. This is also something that I teach a lot on. So this is a really important piece for me. Part of the evolution of the soul is to explore the mind, to liberate the mind, to learn how the mind, the freedom that can be had from understanding what the mind is and the function it plays, and to realize again that thoughts are not self. And so for myself, that's another really big way that I view the world. and then more from a more Christian perspective, to follow God's plan. So it doesn't really matter. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but understanding and asking this question is a really important piece of understanding that high level purpose that we were just talking about. I recently taught this class, and one of the students said, well, the older I get, the more I realize that I don't know anything. So none of these perspectives make sense to me. And I said that in itself is a worldview. So again, looking at what does that actually mean if, as I grow and evolve, and I realize that I have less answers to questions than I thought I had when I was 20, that in and of itself is a lens from which you see the world. And that's a really important piece, again, to understanding our soul level purpose. So who are you? And this is, again, a really important piece of the puzzle, is taking stocks of your talents, strengths, and abilities. Now, you could be looking at this slide and saying, well, I already know what I value, and I know that I'm good at this, and I know that I'm not good at this. And it's not surprising anymore whenever I work with clients and I ask them these really fundamental questions, how often they don't really know, or how often they just adopt the values, worldviews, ideas about who we are, why we're here from, our family, close friends, without really taking a moment and holding those kind of ideas within, again, going back to that internal guidance system, holding it within and say, is that really what I feel, what I think? Or is this something that I was taught to think or feel, and I just kind of adopted it without questioning it? Another thing, even though it's not on here, that I think is really important is to take stock of your weaknesses too. Again, from playful curiosity. It's an interesting data point, because the thing is everybody has weaknesses. We are perfect in our imperfection. So to be able to be honest with ourselves and look at, yes, I'm great at this. I'm not good at that. I get lost in the mall. I do. Even the really small Boise Mall here, I still have a hard time finding my way around. I'm very directionally challenged, and I'm not very good at math. And I have a lot of other talents and strengths, and we need to be able to own all of that. And that's kind of when people talk about the shadow work, that's a piece of it, is just really being able to explore our humanness, but from this place that isn't, like I said, guilt, shame, fear, regret, but just really owning. And I find it interesting too that people are actually pretty good at saying being able to come up with their weaknesses, and not as good at being able to own their strengths and abilities. And it's funny, when they do talk about their weaknesses, it's more from a self-deprecating way. You can tell their tone is that they feel bad that they have those weaknesses, instead of, oh yeah, well, I'm not very good at that. And one of the things I love about the growth mindset is you always say yet at the end of that. So I'm just learning how to ski now, and I'm almost 40. And I always think, it's a mindset to think that I'm too old to do this, or I'm, not smart enough, I'm not good looking enough. And so I always say, I haven't learned to ski yet. And now, in fact, I'm learning to ski. So what do you value? And this is, again, when I do this work with clients, I give them like a list that I Googled, and I give them, it's not even an exhaustive list, just to help people get the juices flowing. Because again, it seems like an easy question, but it's actually quite difficult for most people to answer. So, things like passionate, or nature, dependability, nonconformity. That's actually one of my values. You could just go and you could look up on Google a list of values, and then look at that and just underline and see, oh yeah. And then look at those values and say, again, internal guidance system, are those actually mine? Now, one of the ways that helps you to kind of look at or kind of discern what your values are, to ask yourself some of these questions. So think of a time that you were most proud and contemplate why and what you were doing. And again, think of a time in your life when you were happiness. What contributed to your happiness? What has changed? So oftentimes people will answer those, oh, I was most proud and most happy. Well, I will give you an example of both where I think that they are different questions. So think of a time I was most proud was when I self-published my first book. I was most proud because it required that I looked at every little piece of self-doubt in me, every little fear, every little, who am I to write a book? Why would anybody read anything I've written? Blah, blah, blah. All of this, any little thread of I'm not good enough, it asked me to look at that. And that was probably one of the most difficult things I've ever done. It was just nerve-wracking. I was stressed out. I had problems sleeping. It was work. So if you go back to the previous slide when we were talking about what is the meaning of life, and my meaning of life is evolution of the soul, you can see why I was most proud of myself during that time, because it was the challenge, it was the soul lessons, it was, kind of doing that spiraling up, moving through my stuff. That's all an important piece of my answer to the meaning of life. Second thing, when was I the happiest? One of my favorite time periods in my life is when I lived in this really small mountain town with my husband, and I had 3 part-time jobs. My husband had 5 part-time jobs, but there was something so, like, I would come home from work and we'd go mountain biking. I'd come from work, we'd go hiking, we'd go on a Tuesday and hang out at my friend's house and have a barbecue. There was something so light and playful about it. And when you answer these questions, look at it, your answer represents something deeper. So it's not just the place that I lived in, it was the experience I was able to have. And if I look at it, there was a level of freedom. And that's what contributed to my happiness. And freedom is really high on my values list. Same with, the time I was most proud. It was very difficult, but it represented me looking at my shit. And that to me is really high up on my values list as well. So even when we think about some of our goals, like I want to lose 10 pounds, that 10 pounds represents something. It's not just about the outcome. That 10 pounds might represent better work-life balance. That 10 pounds might represent self-control. There's lots of different things. And again, that will be unique to the individual. There isn't just one right answer. But anytime that we look at some of these goals, we just passed New Year's resolutions. Some of you might still be doing them. Probably not, though, if history teaches us anything. But look back at your New Year's resolutions. Look back at some of your goals and say, what do those goals represent? And that's another way to assist you in understanding what your values are. So again, it might be self-trust, it might be, confidence, whatever the case may be. Look at what symbolically that means something. There's an experience there. Oftentimes when I'm doing this and people will say travel is something that they really enjoy. What is the experience of travel? What does travel represent to you? Because there's parts of travel that really suck, like TSA lines and recycled air and lugging your luggage everywhere. It's uncomfortable. But there's something about the experience of travel. And for lots of people, once we break it down, it is actually freedom. For some people, it's anonymity. And that anonymity, you can even break it down farther. It's not having freedom from the expectation, other people's expectations or obligations. So this is just kind of a way that you can play with it. If you really, if you're not super in touch with your internal guidance system, you can play with some of these questions and then break them down and look underneath and underneath and underneath. What do they really represent to you? So the next thing is, what do you love? I have this quote here: passion is energy. Feel the power that comes from focusing on what excites you. I was with a friend, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 months ago, And I kind of asked this question about, what brings you a lot of joy? What ways do you play in your life? I think that's because I'm a very playful person and I play a lot. And I think part of that, he's 10, so he's kind of moving out of wanting to play with me, but he still plays with me a little bit. And she kind of sat there for a second and was like, I don't think I play anymore. And for me, that lightness, that passion, that desire, that play, they're all very intimately linked. So looking at what really, lights that internal fire, when something, maybe it's a really fun topic you like to explore, like sitting around and talking about philosophy or, the meaning of life, or maybe it's, doing the specific hobby, or maybe it's going for a hike, or whatever it is, what makes you feel alive inside? And I love that expression. And I actually, it's my friend, Jacob Norby. He wrote this book called Blessed Are the Weird, a manifesto for creatives. And I want to read a little Beatitudes for the Weird. And I'll bring this all together in a moment. It says, blessed are the weird people, poets, misfits, writers, mystics, heretics, painters, and troubadours, for they teach us to see the world through different eyes. Blessed are those who embrace the intensity of life's pain and pleasure, for they shall be rewarded with uncommon ecstasy. Blessed are ye who see beauty in ugliness, for you shall transform our vision of how the world might be. Blessed are the bold and whimsical, for their imagination shatters ancient boundaries of fear for us all. Blessed are ye who are mocked for unbridled expression of love in all its forms, because your kind of crazy is exactly that freedom for which the world is unconsciously begging. Blessed are those who have endured breaking by life, for they are the resplendent cracks through which the light shines. And I love that, because often my clients, when they come to see me, it is trying to get into that creative self again, into that playful self, that passionate self, that joyful self. And this is what, going back to, I think, the second or third slide, when we talked about living incongruent, when we have not gotten in touch with who we are and we're just going through the motions of life, that's takes us, we stop being creative, we stop playing, we stop doing all of those things. And it's amazing to watch when you get people again connected with things, with that center of themselves, to see how all of this stuff starts to blossom and bloom. I actually have this thing in my office, one of my most favorite quotes. And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. And I see lots of people, they come into my office and they're like, I want to get back in touch with that person. And, that person within themselves. And oftentimes what's stopping them is worrying about what would they say. What if I said no when I really wanted to say no? What if I decided to dress a little bit crazy and wear my hair a little bit long and, do all of these things that they were part of us. And then kind of as we started to move further and further from who we truly are, we kind of let all of those things go. And that's why, watching children, and they explore the world, they get down on the floor, they get up on a chair, they run on the couch, they do all of these things. And as we get older, we sit in the same spot every day and watch TV. We sit in the same spot to eat our dinner. We have the same motions, and we forget that our bodies are these really dynamic things that love to move, that love to connect to that passionate energy, that joy, that playfulness. Now, you might not be running around and playing hide and go seek, but there's still ways that you can play as an adult. Recently here in Boise, they had this silent disco. And so we went, and everybody, it was this large kind of ballroom, and everybody had these headphones on that had several different stations, so you could listen to different DJs. So there was two different DJs. So you could one was disco and one was something else. And then every hour they changed DJs. And so you're in this room, and it wasn't a bar. It was just like this big ballroom, and people of all ages are just dancing and grooving. And I was like, yes, this is beautiful. So that's a version of adult play. Taking an adult hip hop class, going to an open mic night, all of these things, like getting back in touch with our creative selves. So when you think about, this idea of what do you love, are there things in your life that still bring you joy? Are there things in your life that you still lose time doing? So that's a really good indication when you get so into something that all of a sudden you're like, wow, I've been doing this for an hour and a half, and I didn't even notice. The time just flew by. And then conversely, what do you do that makes you resentful? And this, again, I see this all the time, people saying yes when they really want to say no. And I'm going to tell you that nothing is a more drag on our energy than doing things from a place of obligation. Because when you start to do things from a place of obligation, you get resentful. And it's very, it just weighs you down. And, people will say, but then who would volunteer? Who would do this? Well, again, I don't really enjoy volunteering at my son's school. I don't enjoy being around lots of other kids, but I do love to cook. So anytime that they need anything for parties, and you need treats or healthy snacks or whatever, I'm always the first to volunteer doing that, because I can do that wholeheartedly. And that's a question that I invite my clients to ask when they are presented with something. Ask yourself, can I do this wholeheartedly? And of course, I'm not talking about if your boss says, I need you to do this, but you'll realize that when you start to get in touch with that passion and that playfulness and that lightness, that even when you do get asked, maybe you have a task at your job that you don't really love, it becomes less of a burden, because you have such a fire within you that becomes, it becomes much easier. So I hope that as you're listening to this, when I asked you, what do you love, that there was something that immediately, whether it was fly fishing or, needlepoint or whatever, that there's something that really fuels that fire within you. And think about the ways that you can now let that creative self out. And that could be cooking, it could be painting, it could be yoga, it could be dance, it could be anything, but finding a way. Again, if you go back to your values, was there something on there about passion or desire or adventure or, wonderment? And are you making that a priority in your life? So other really important questions is, how do you define happiness? And this is a good question to sit down and actually write out. Again, it's one of those things, I can tell when I feel happy or when I don't feel happy. But you'll realize that if you actually think about, what does happiness mean to you, it doesn't always mean it doesn't always mean being in a state of happiness all the time. Happiness could be, being able to kind of go with the flow a little bit more. It could mean feeling safe and secure in a relationship. It could mean, there's lots of different ways. Again, there's no right answer, but really realizing that happiness is a state, and that's bigger than happiness as an emotion. And so when we look at happiness, it's a much larger experience than just feeling happy all the time. But what we're really asking is, what does that word happiness represent to you? What would that look like in your life? So, and then how do you define success? Again, this is another question that sometimes people will say to me, well, isn't that the same thing? And I'll say, well, maybe for you it is, but that's it, not necessarily, right? So looking at what success, and success, again, if you look at it as a bigger thing, a bigger pool of experience than, I'm meeting all the quotas at work. Like, what does success mean for you internally? And so that could include way more things than just, job and money. Success could be, about the way you intimacy in relationships. It could be, it could be connected to happiness, being able to find that place of inner peace. So as you look at those, the more internal you can make them versus having those things satisfied by things that are external to us in the environment, I think that, again, really helps us get in touch with what it is we value. Another really great question is, in the biggest version of yourself, what would you be doing? So before we let our mind get all in there and say, oh, well, I'd love to be an actor. And then, well, I'm too old to act, and I'm not good looking enough, and I'm not skinny enough. In the biggest version of yourself, what would you be doing? So before you get in there with doubt and self-deprecation, and then after you create that, after you let yourself play with that idea, be light, be playful, think big. Don't let yourself be weighed down by all of these, but oh, what ifs, da, da, da. Because that version, again, just like the 10 pounds, represents something bigger. So it's not just about the role you'd be doing. Well, I'd be traveling around the world. What does that travel represent to you? And can you create that experience in another way? So maybe you don't have, $10 million to go travel the world, but if you understand that that means freedom to you, or that it means anonymity, which means, relieving yourself of other people's expectations, you can certainly find ways to create that in your life without traveling around the world. And you could, travel the next state over. You could go for a road trip. I mean, there's ways that you could do it to make that happen, but really get underneath it and look at what does that experience represent for you. Because freedom, if we look at freedom, that can be mental freedom, that could be emotional freedom, that freedom in having a different job. There's all these different ways. So once you understand what that biggest version of yourself represents, you can start to find ways to create it in your life right now. So who do you admire, and what do you admire about them? I think this is a great question because, again, it helps us get clear on our values. And also, too, when we realize that the people that we really admire, they're probably, you recognize their humanness and you love them even when you recognize their humanness. And part of their humanness, their quirkiness, their idiosyncrasies, all of those things probably make you love them even more. So, going back to that, what do you desire, and joy and lightfulness? And I said that often when I work with people, it's other people's opinions or our perception of other people's opinions that prevents us from being who we are. But if we look at our friends, or we look at somebody maybe in our community that we really admire, we get to recognize their humanness and we still love them. And that's a really good way to explore self-compassion, is say, what would I say to a friend if they were in this circumstance, or if they were saying, oh, I don't know if I should do this because somebody might say something. You would tell them to go for it. So I think that that's a really cool question to ask yourself too. And then this coming again, looking at things from understanding that we are part of something larger. Are there causes? Are there things going on in this world that makes your heart hurt? And that's another thing, if we talk about high-level purpose, is there a way that we can contribute to some of those things that are larger than us? So I gave you a lot of questions here today. And I hope, you can go through them, and really I suggest you write them down. And when we talk about high-level purpose, it's these things like success and happiness and the biggest versions of ourselves that really help us to connect. We start to look at the answers and we see the common thread moving in and weaving out around them. And so then we can look at and say, yes, this is the experience. This is how I express the inner sides of me, or the inner parts of me in the outside world. One of my most favorite quotes, too, is Arthur Schopenhauer. Every person takes the limits of their own field of vision for the limits of the world. And that's why understanding your worldview is so important, whether you're conservative or liberal, or, the meaning of life is the liberation of the mind, whatever it is. You have to realize that's the lens from which you see the world. And again, so much of that stuff might have been adopted from family and friends, from stuff that we, gathered from childhood before we had a level of discernment. And so once we understand that, then we can challenge that. You know, we kind of got this thing going on in our world right now where, especially on social media, where if somebody doesn't agree with us, we all of a sudden put them in the them category. So then it becomes us versus them instead. And I feel like it didn't used to be that way, that we used to be able to listen to other people speak and witness their humanity and be able to hear what they have to say and not have moved from this very reactive place and moving into this us versus them kind of situation. Because honestly, that's kind of the best time to be able to challenge it, what it is that we value and who it is we think we are and the lens from which we see the world. So if you're scanning your Facebook page and somebody posts something and all of a sudden you have this very triggered response, that's a beautiful opportunity to pull back for a minute and say, what about this is triggering me? Is it A, that's just so far outside of my value system that it's triggering something deep? It's just, it's something that I really, really care about. Or is it B, it's challenging some belief I have about the world that maybe doesn't need to be there anymore. So be able to listen, show compassion, and then use it as a data point for yourself to say, I wonder, playful curiosity again, I wonder what that's really about. And that even might help you get clearer and refine, because maybe it is really connected to a value that you have. But then you can look at it deeper and deeper and say, okay, so what does that represent? Interesting. I never knew that was that important to me. And once you have that piece of information, then you can realign your priorities with that. So the last thing I want to talk about, I have a couple more minutes here. I wanted to wrap this up within an hour, is how do you keep yourself small? So again, what limitations do you put on yourself and the world? So that's a really, again, understanding your values, your worldview. What is it that in what ways do you limit your potential? Just like I talked about the growth mindset and saying, I'm not good at math yet. Are you creating agreements with yourself about what you believe is possible or what you believe is possible in the world? And again, challenging those, right? I never thought I would start skiing at 40, but I'm doing it, right? And especially, as I'm heading into 40, and people have a lot of ideas about aging. And so, they'll go, they wouldn't have skied the entire season, and then they go out and they ski 8 hours, and then the next day they're super sore and they go, oh my gosh, I'm too old for this. No, you're just too out of shape to go skiing for 8 hours in a day. So stop putting those things in place. That isn't to say that there aren't some real things. I was giving that example in the class the other day, and they're like, but what about my eyes? I have to get glasses. And I told a story, and I guess I might be a little strange, but my whole life I wanted glasses, and I never needed them until I was 39 years old. And so when I got glasses, I was super excited that I needed glasses, because now who would have thought I got a new face 39 years later, and I can accessorize it. So I thought it was pretty exciting. Again, right? It's a mindset. Both of those are stories. My story is that, yay, I got a new face. And their story is, oh, I'm getting so old. My eyes are failing me. So again, both are stories. Both are true and not true. So we get to decide, what is your perception of failure? And what are your self-sabotaging behaviors, both conscious and unconscious? So there's ways. I find that people are afraid of success, and some are afraid of failure. And again, it really goes back to this idea of, what will people think of me? And sometimes people are going to think things of you, but oftentimes it's our perception of their perception. And having worked with a lot of people, lots of cancer survivors, almost all of them say, I wish I would have cared less. I wish I would have, taken time to go on that vacation. I would have read that book I wanted to read. Instead of trying to, fulfill these quotas, fulfill these expectations, these outcomes, worrying about, oh, what if I try that and I look stupid? What if somebody laughs at me? And so when people have really had to face their own questions of their own life and death, they realize they get to this place where they become unapologetically them. And they're like, I don't have time to worry about what somebody I'm not even going to remember in 5 years. I don't have time to remember about what they would think about me. So think about the ways that you prevent yourself from really living the life you want. And then looking at what are there ways that you continually sabotage, both conscious and unconscious. Maybe that's what Netflix is really about, is that there's this big project that you want to work on that might put you more in the spotlight. So you find a way to be distracted for 3 weeks watching 7 seasons of Lost. That's a true story. I've done that. So last thing I just want to leave you with is it's a very famous quote. It says, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? We were all meant to shine as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. So I really highly suggest that if this is something that you want to explore more, that you want to get excited and feel connected to your life, to work through some of these questions that I gave you here today. Of course, I do this work with people, so if you'd like some more one-on-one attention, you can do that with me. I would love to work with you. But just think about what is really the whole point of this igniting your life's purpose is just, it's not something that's external. It's something that is internal. So when we look in and we really get clear what's in our heart, what's in our mind, what it is we value, what makes us joyful, all of those things. And then we go out in the world and we find ways to let that have an expression, to let that be an experience that you have. So it's not just a single role. It's all these ways that we allow what's within us to be expressed outwardly. And that to me is what purpose is. Well, that is our webinar for today. If you have any questions before we wrap up here, you can find the chat at the bottom and feel free to write me a message. And for those of you, quite a few of you sent me a message that you would like to listen to the replay. I look forward to hearing from you guys as well. Well, I think we will call that a night. I hope that you guys have a great rest of the night. And if you have any questions or comments, again, my name is Angela Levesque, and you can find more about me at angelalevesque.com. Thank you for being here.